Good morning, everybody. I'm Don Stewart, and welcome to another edition of Breaking News. Today is Sunday, the 6th day of April, 2025. Now, in the headlines, there seems to be a contrast between the actions of Israel and the perceived inactions of the United States with respect to foreign policy. We're going to look at three stories today, and it's going to bring up some fascinating possibilities of what may happen next. And like we always say here on Breaking News, we know what eventually is going to happen because we've got the Bible that tells us at the end of this age, Christ will return. There's a number of events that will happen that will precede it, and we see things falling into place that will, fulfill all of this. But like we always say, in the meantime, we have to be careful of saying this is going to happen next, or that's going to happen next, or the U.S. is going to do this, or Israel's going to do that, or Russia will do that. We just don't know. And these stories are really fascinating. So we'll talk about them today, okay? Here's the three. First of all, Turkey is left fuming after Israel demolishes key military bases in Syria. This is from the Israeli I-24 news. And it basically confirms what we've been saying. Israel will not let any foothold grow in Syria with Turkey or any, just like Hezbollah needs to be eliminated in Lebanon, just like Hamas needs to be eliminated in Gaza and the West Bank, Judea, Samaria. They need to eliminate the Hamas's influence there. So, with respect to its borders, Israel's doing everything it can militarily, and they're getting the job done to have peace with the various borders, at least a cessation of hostilities. Now, on the other hand, there's two other stories here. One comes from the New Eastern Outlook, and we talk about this. This is a Russian site, and this is their perspective, and it's fascinating. But here's their perception. Policy reversal. Why is the U.S. softening its position on Iran? That's a good question because many Israelis are asking the same thing. And then another, this time it's from an Israeli news site, Israel National News. Isolationist dangers of Trump doctrine. Defending the Western world remains America's historical responsibility and destiny. In other words, America needs to step up and do, not just say, but do what it needs to do with respect to Russia, with respect also to Iran. So we're going to look at this. Now, so as we're going to observe, well, Israel's going full on to rid its borders of its enemies. The U.S. is seemingly going back and forth of what it's going to do. And this is the perception right now, whether it's true or not. So let's look at the stories. Headline number one. Turkey is left fuming after Israel demolishes key military bases in Syria. Ankara is positioning itself to play a major role in the post-Assad Syria, filling a vacuum left by Iran in a development that has put Israel on edge. And like we say, this is perfectly consistent with what the Bible says is going to be the situation at the time of the end. Now, the Israelis have struck the Palmyra air bases in Syria's Homs province, the main airport in the Hama province. The attacks came despite Ankara's efforts to reassure Washington that a deeper military presence in Syria was not intended to threaten Israel. This is from Turkey's response, which of course is a lie. That's exactly why they're there. Now, Turkish military teams in recent weeks have scoped out all three sites, and four officials speaking on condition anonymity have told Reuters the following. This is the destruction that's gone on. The runway, tower, hangars, and the planes were grounded at one site. It's a tough message that Israel won't accept that the expanded Turkish presence, said one of the intelligence officers who spoke to the news agency. In other words, Israel's not understanding that this is just supposedly a peaceful help. The idea is they're going to help Syria kind of gather itself together as a nation that's been since 2011 kind of balkanized, cut into various sections. So Turkey's, we're just trying to help Syria. That's what they're saying. So as the next line goes, Ankara is positioning itself to play a major role in the new Syria. Again, filling the vacuum left by Iran in an expansion of Turkish sway that has put Israel, which is already embroiled in multi-front wars of survival for the last year and a half, on edge, and rightly so, because Turkey has been an enemy of Israel in recent years. So here's our take on this. We're not surprised by this move from Turkey since it confirms that it will be a player in the last days against Israel per the Ezekiel 38-39 invasion, where it takes part. The United States, on the other hand, is a wild card in all of this. We are not a last days Bible prophecy. And the next two articles state it in some very interesting ways. So we're going to look at it. Okay, comes from the New Eastern Outlook. It's the Russian site. Policy reversal. Why is the U.S. softening its position on Iran? Now, they're not the only ones, like we said, asking this question. The author is a corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Natural Sciences. He's an expert on Arab world affairs named Viktor Mikhin. Here's what he says. Here's his take. In the recent days, the Trump administration, known for its hardline stance on Iran, has shown unexpected shifts in rhetoric. U.S. Special Envoy for the Middle East Affairs, Steve Witkoff, who previously advocated for a policy of maximum pressure on Tehran, now speaks of the need for confidence building and resolving disagreements. This sharp turn in foreign policy strategy raises many questions. What exactly prompted Washington to change its approach? What factors influence the decision to soften its stance? And most importantly, does the U.S. have a real plan of action, or is this just a temporary tactical maneuver? The softening of U.S. rhetoric is a clear sign that the maximum pressure has failed. That's according to the Russians now. An analysis of the situation suggests that the policy shift is tied to a combination of factors, from the failure of the sanctions to the Trump administration's domestic political calculations. Additionally, Iran's response and that of the international community play a key role in determining how events will unfold. And then they have a headline: the failure of maximum pressure. Gives a little history lesson. In 2018, under Trump, remember, the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was instituted under Obama, expecting that harsh sanctions would force Iran to make concessions. The Trump administration believed economic strangulation would either lead to regime change in Tehran or its surrender on the nuclear issue. However, these calculations proved wrong. Instead of backing down, Iran responded by escalating its nuclear activities. According to the Atomic Energy Association, Tehran has significantly increased its stockpile of enriched uranium and began developing more advanced centrifuges. And that's getting on the way to make a nuclear weapon. And also, too, and here's really one of the wild cards here: Iran has strengthened its ties with both Russia and China, finding alternative ways to bypass sanctions. As a result, the maximum pressure policy not only failed to achieve its goals, but from Washington's perspective, worsened the situation by bringing Iran closer to developing nuclear weapons. Now, Washington seems to have realized that isolating Iran hasn't worked and is attempting to shift to diplomatic methods. The question, however, is whether it's too late. Tehran, hardened by bitter experience, is unlikely to agree to new negotiations without serious guarantees. Now, again, they go on and list what U.S. must do in the article. And basically, the Russian website, U.S. basically capitulate to Iran, to get some type of half-baked peace, which of course could be the worst thing that could possibly happen. As we talked about yesterday with that article from Gatestone, Iran just says, just wants to talk while they're building their, way towards a nuclear weapon, plus having the delivery system that can get the little Satan in Israel, the big Satan in the U.S. And so they don't seem to think the U.S. It's interesting, this article, that the U.S. with its military might will help solve the matter with, even though they're right on the cusp there, Diego Garcia with the B-2 bombers, with the second aircraft carrier, moving towards Carl Vinson, moving towards the area of the Middle East. Well, the area, as Truman's already there, basically to set the stage for some type of attack on Iran. So they ignore that possibility. Now, a third article here, third headline, comes from an Israeli rabbi, and it's really interesting because it's on the website Israel National News. And granted, all the major news sites in Israel are leftist leaning, but this one has this headline: "Defending the Western World Remains America's Historic Responsibility and Destiny." Now, this guy doesn't think Trump's doing enough. Well, I'll read the article and you get the idea here. He says, "By now, everyone has heard of the Trump doctrine, encapsulated in the words Make America Great Again," in President Trump's foreign policy terms, and judging from his bellicose words and threatening actions, it also implies make America isolated again and make America neutral again, as well as make America a peacemaker again, as President Trump has publicly abandoned Ukraine, attacked its elected leaders, cast doubt on America's alliance and commitments to NATO, and aligns himself with Russia, as led by a former KGB agent, Putin, who everyone regards as a dictator. Now, it's interesting. The editor from this website said Trump is, of course, trying to woo Russia away from Iran in order to enable a joint effort against its nuclear arms race. That's the editor's comment. So this guy is not really being objective here in the article. But nevertheless, what he is saying is something that many people out there are saying. Here it goes on. Trump talks about avoiding nuclear war and the dangers of bringing World War III while his policies may unintentionally and with seemingly self-righteousness actually be contributing to the outbreak of another world conflagration. Why? By taking America out of play and thus making the world unstable and unsafe. He's making enemies and trying to make friends out of America's and the West's enemies, such as Russia, China, and North Korea, and making enemies out of America's historical friends, such as Canada, Mexico, and many countries of Europe, of the world that look to America for protection and leadership. The long-term implications for Israel of Trump's policies are also seriously and troubling, and this gets to the root of the matter here. As has been noted by some writers, Trump is actually a peacenik, and that is how he clearly perceives himself in a war to the death between Russia and Ukraine. He's obviously appeasing Putin and Russia by constantly attacking Zelensky and Ukraine. He blames Biden's stupidity for America giving Ukraine $350 billion in aid for its self-defense against Russia invasion and aggression. All the while, Russia has in recent times invaded and bloodied Chechnya, invaded by Russia in 1994, Georgia, that's the country of Georgia, not the state, obviously, by Russia in 2008, Syria, invaded that by Russia in 2015, and now Ukraine, invaded by Russia in 2014 and 2022. The American aid that was for Ukraine was ultimately for the defense of the Western world and the Western alliance, of which America is the leader, and puts the brakes on Russia's open ambitions to recreate this crumbled and now defunct Soviet Union. The latest sounds and reports coming out of Trump's emissaries, direct negotiations and by his negotiators with Hamas, also seem to indicate that he is driven by visions of peace in dealing with the Arabs, even the jihadist terrorists of Hamas. He's rightly proud of his track record with the Arab countries that signed the Abraham Accord, and he mentions a number of countries that are now involved in this, who are nevertheless not, and here's the key, they're not on Israel's border. In other words, these peace agreements are from countries like Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Sudan. They're not bordering Israel. And so, as the article says, they pale in comparison. He's not accomplished more with other peace treaties, not counting the trade and tourism, which Israel's gone down the tubes with during this time with Hamas, with the fight. Israel also has the Arabs of Egypt and Jordan that do share critical borders with Israel itself, that are not really happy with what Israel is doing right now. So, as the article finishes off, it says Trump is guided by a vision of peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia as he talks about wanting to make a deal with the Iranian Ayatollahs, ignoring the fact that the rulers of both Saudi Arabia and Iran are not merely opposing conventional businessmen and Khilafahs who want to make a deal, but they are ruthless, bloodthirsty, fanatical Islamic fundamentalists who are opposed to the Western world's way of life and want to utterly destroy it. And this is absolutely correct. This is what Islam's all about, radical Islam led by Iran, but also the Saudis too. They don't want democracy, civil society, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and all the liberties that Western societies and countries enjoy and take for granted. They're not going to come to this. Israel is, the only country in that area of the world that has values such as ours. And by going to these other ones and expecting they're going to bring about some type of new world or peace is just unrealistic. More immediately, more worrisome as the article continues, is the ongoing historical tendency of the USA to veer toward isolation and neutrality and even artificial peacemaking, which it has long assumed the title of a dominant world power, superpower, with its responsibility to the rest of the world, is particularly responsible for the Western world, not because it's part of that world, but it's an indispensable and indisputed leader. And the article basically goes on and talks about, and this is true, and this is something that's funny, I have it in mind, both World War I and World War II, part of the reason they came about was the isolation of America, when America could have done more. And what the writer of this article is saying, if the U.S. doesn't step forward and take the lead as it should, then we're going to have World War III here. And if they ignore these sorts of things, they haven't learned from history. Basically, America will find itself in a situation where it actually allows either a global conflict or something else to take place. So, as the article ends, when America ignores all these things and what's going on, being an isolated country, it reverts to kind of a default self-destructive cocoon, inducing a false sense of security from impossible neutrality, selfish isolationism, fanciful peacemaking, and self-destructive fence-sitting. It falls into the traps that both contributed that brought World War I and World War II. Hopefully, it won't bring about the world to the doorsteps of World War III. Now, this last sentence sums up the fear there, and it's a realistic fear. Is the U.S. Is the U.S. following the same patterns that brought about the last two world wars? The fact that Trump has used military might of the U.S. to neutralize the Houthis threat in Yemen seems to speak against this idea. However, we will have to wait to see what occurs in the short term. Now, what we do know from Scripture, what the long-term results will be, and we don't know exactly how we're going to get there. Recall the U.S. is not a player in last days Bible prophecy as to why we must wait and see. There are a number of different possibilities. So the proverbial push is coming to shove right now. Netanyahu is supposed to arrive in Washington, D.C. tomorrow to talk to Trump. Now, the headline is about the 17% tariffs that Israel has to pay. And that's not why he's there. He's going to talk about Iran. That's the main thing. What's going to happen there? Are the U.S. and Iran going to do something? Now, as we have said, the U.S. all they have to do is kind of, do enough destruction to Iran's nuclear program to set them back a number of years. There are other things going on right now that we alluded to a week or two ago that are in the works that would make Iran, and it has to do with their internal problems, make Iran problematic there, where they really can't move forward. So, in other words, you've got it coming from a number of different ways, but the U.S. seemingly must do something with all its military assets right there. Will they? And when will they do it? As we've talked about over and over again, this is the big question, and we will have to wait and see. So possibly as early as tomorrow, we'll get some answers with Netanyahu after he talks with Trump and see if Israel now has the assurance that they can go ahead and the U.S. will go ahead and not just go with endless talks, endless worthless questions, and with these worthless advisors that Trump has that says, well, we can negotiate a deal. He put these people in there as advisors who are business people who have no idea what's going on in the Middle East. It's a very, very sad situation. But how will it end? Again, we don't know. That's why we deal with the stories every day. And we always say, stay tuned, because the good news is we know eventually what's going to happen. But on the other hand, in the meantime, well, we watch and pray, and we continue to watch and pray. I'm Don Stewart. Thanks for watching. We'll be back today with another edition of Breaking News, along with our further summaries of our 25 signs where near the end on your Bible questions answered. So until then, may the Lord richly, richly bless.